The silk of Lady Alara Vance's gown, once a brilliant, snowdrop white, now felt like London's own grimy twilight against her skin. It scraped, a constant, whispering accusation with every slight shift of her shoulders. She stood perfectly still by the potted ferns at the edge of the Danworth ballroom, a statue of ruined ivory. Around her, the world was a blurred watercolor of peacock blue jackets and lemon yellow skirts, spinning to a waltz that sounded tinny and distant, like music from a far-off room. It was April 23rd, 1817. The Danworth Spring Ball at 17, Grosvenor Square. Just 3 hours ago, this had been the pinnacle of her debut season. The chandeliers, all 12 of them, had sparkled with promise. Now, their light felt hot and searching. She focused on the cool, smooth stem of a single flower in her hand, a gardenia, its petals beginning to curl and brown at the edges. It smelled too sweet, cloying. She had tucked a matching one into the buttonhole of Viscount Henry Creswell's waistcoat just that afternoon in the Danworth garden, a secret token between them. A promise. She could still see the exact shade of his cornflower blue eyes as he'd smiled and kissed her fingers. Now, that same gardenia was fresh and white in his buttonhole across the room. He was laughing, his head thrown back, standing much too close to Miss Arabella Thistlethwaite, whose cheeks were pink with triumph. The fracture in Alara's world wasn't a loud crack. It was this silent, public detail. That flower. He hadn't even bothered to remove it. A wave of heat rushed up her neck. She could feel individual beads of sweat tracing a path down her spine beneath the heavy silk. The scent of beeswax candles, expensive perfume, and the faint odor of damp wool from the crowd mixed into a nauseating soup. She concentrated on the floor. The black and white marble tiles were a dizzying chessboard. She was a piece that had been captured, just waiting to be swept from the board. Time moved in strange pulses. She could hear the steady, heavy asterisk tick, tack, asterisk of the long case clock in the hallway, each swing of its brass pendulum measuring the death of her reputation. A minute felt like an hour. A whisper from a group of ladies to her left sliced through the music. A pity, one said, her voice carrying perfectly. Her family invested so much in this season. £6,000, I heard. The words weren't meant to be private. They were part of her sentence. Alara's fingers tightened around the gardenia stem. A thorn she hadn't noticed pricked her thumb, a sharp, clean pain. She welcomed it. It was real. Her mother, from across the room, caught her eye. Lady Vance's face was a mask of porcelain calm, but her eyes were wide, dark pools of panic. Her father had already retreated to the card room. The abandonment was a physical chill. This was the last normal moment. The last moment she would be Lady Alara Vance, promising debutante. The hairline fracture in her reality was now a canyon. The lie was that this was a simple social misstep. The truth, which everyone now knew, was that she had staked her entire future on a man's private word, and he had decided it was worthless. She was just considering whether her legs would carry her to the terrace doors without buckling when a new sound cut through the murmurs and music. It was a crisp, wet, shocking asterisk crunch star. The sound of someone biting into a hard apple. Conversation stuttered. Heads turned like sunflowers seeking a new sun. Alara's gaze followed. In the grand archway of the ballroom, leaning against the carved oak frame as if he owned it, stood a man. He was tall, with hair the color of dark walnut, and he wore a black jacket that was impeccably tailored but somehow looked defiant against the sea of colors. In his hand was a half-eaten apple. Silas Thorne, the Tun's most notorious rogue. He wasn't on the guest list. He was never on guest lists. He simply appeared where he pleased, a storm cloud at a garden party. He took another slow, deliberate bite, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. His eyes, a cool, assessing grey, swept the room. They passed over the flushed hostess, over a gaping Lord Creswell, and then they landed on Alara. He didn't look away. He studied her, a lone, white-clad figure by the ferns, her disgrace hanging about her like fog. A slow, unreadable smile touched his lips. He discarded the apple core carelessly onto a footman's silver tray. And then he did the most shocking thing. He offered a bow. A deep, Theatrical, gallant beau. Directed squarely at her. A fresh wave of whispers erupted, louder this time, buzzing with confusion and scandalized delight. The attention, which had been a crushing weight, suddenly shifted. It was no longer just about her ruin. It was about this star. What connection could a ruined debutante possibly have with Silas Thorne? Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird. Every instinct told her to look down, to fade, to weep. But something else rose up in her, hot and sharp. It was anger, yes, but also a desperate, clawing pride. Henry Creswell had taken everything else. He would not take her last shred of dignity. She met Silas Thorne's grey eyes from across the room. Her chin lifted, just a precise quarter-inch. It was the smallest of movements, but it was a choice. She did not look away. The music started up again, awkwardly. The crowd began to move, but their eyes kept flicking between Thorne and Alara, a new, thrilling drama unfolding. Thorne straightened up and began to move through the crowd, which parted for him as if he were hot to the touch. He walked with a loose-limbed confidence, heading not toward the Duke, nor the prettiest girl, but on a direct path toward the potted ferns. He stopped before her. Up close, he was older than she'd thought, maybe 30, with faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He smelled of crisp winter air, leather, and that faint, tart scent of apple. "Seems we are both surplus to requirements this evening," he murmured. His voice was lower than the music, a private rumble just for her. Alara found her voice. It came out steadier than she felt. "I doubt you are ever surplus, Mr. Thorne. More often, you are the requirement others fail to meet." His eyebrow quirked. For a second, he looked genuinely surprised, then amused. "Indeed. May I?" He offered his arm. She stared at it. This was the point of no return. To take the arm of London's most infamous rogue, while wearing the gown of her very public ruin, was social suicide. But then, she was already socially deceased. What more could they do to her? She placed her fingertips lightly on the black wool of his sleeve. The fabric was surprisingly soft. He led her not toward the dance floor, but through the terrace doors, out into the cool April night. The air was a relief, washing over her hot face. The sounds of the ball became muffled, replaced by the trickle of a garden fountain and the distant clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones. They stopped by a stone balustrade overlooking the shadowy garden. He released her arm and turned to face her, his expression turning businesslike. "I have a proposition, Lady Alara," he said, getting straight to the point. "You need a lifeline. I find myself in sudden, and somewhat tedious, need of a wife with an impeccable, untarnished family name. Yours, despite tonight's theatrics, still qualifies." Alara blinked. "You wish to marry me?" "I wish for a mutually beneficial arrangement," he corrected. "A business contract. You will be Mrs. Silas Thorne. You will have my considerable fortune at your disposal, a sum exceeding £40,000 a year. You will host dinners, smile at parties, and present a picture of perfect, respectable matrimony. In return, I get the shield of your family standing. Your father is still a baron. Your lineage goes back to the Normans. It's the one thing I cannot buy outright." The audacity of it took her breath away. Her ruin wasn't an end. To him, it was a market fluctuation, a discounted opportunity. "Why the sudden need for respectability?" she asked, her mind reeling. "My reasons are my own," he said, his gaze shifting to the dark garden. "But the need is immediate. Think of it. You walk back in there on my arm tonight, and the whispers change. They become about your astonishing conquest, not your crushing defeat. Creswell becomes a footnote, a man who lost the prize to a better player." The word prize stung, but the image he painted, it was a lifeline, thrown from a most unexpected and possibly dangerous ship. She thought of her mother's panicked eyes, her father's retreat. She thought of a future as a spinster aunt, hidden away in the country, a cautionary tale. Then she thought of walking back into that bright, noisy room, her head high, on the arm of the man who terrified them all. She looked down at her own hands, still clutching the ruined gardenia. She opened her fingers and let it fall, a small, white blot against the dark stone of the terrace. "And what?" she said, looking back up at him, her new, sharp-edged courage finding its voice. "Are the terms of this contract?" Silas Thorne's smile returned, this time reaching his eyes. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who appreciated a good negotiation. "Now," he said, offering his arm once more, "we discuss the details." And as she took it, the distant music from the ballroom seemed to shift, becoming not a funeral dirge, but the opening bars of a far more dangerous and intriguing dance. The terrace air was cool, but Alara's face felt like it was on fire. Her fingertips, resting on the rough black wool of Silas Thorne's sleeve, tingled with a strange, buzzing energy. It was the feeling of jumping from a great height, that moment of suspension before you know if you'll fly or fall. The sounds of the Danworth ball, the waltz, the laughter, were muffled now, a distant play they had both walked out of. He led her to a stone bench tucked beside a climbing rose, still just thorny branches in the April chill. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, but with the directness of a man discussing a shipping contract. She sat, the cold of the stones seeping through the thin silk of her gown. He remained standing, a dark outline against the golden light streaming from the ballroom windows. "The proposition is simple," he began, his voice low and practical. "We announce our engagement tonight. A whirlwind romance, discovered in the face of adversity. Poetic, really. The banns will be read for 3 weeks. We marry quietly at St. George's on Hanover Square on the 20th of May. You move into my house on Berkeley Square. In public, we are a devoted, if somewhat surprising, couple. You restore the shine to my dubious reputation. I provide you with an unassailable fortress from which to face society." Alara's mind raced, trying to catch up. "An unassailable fortress built on a lie," she said, the words tasting bitter. "All of Mayfair is built on lies, Lady Alara," he replied, his grey eyes catching the moonlight. "The difference with ours is that we will both know the blueprint. No hidden weaknesses. No false promises of affection. Just mutual utility." He laid out the terms like a banker. She would have a quarterly allowance of £800 for her personal use, a staggering sum. She would be the mistress of his household, with authority over all staff and social affairs. He would provide her with a townhouse wardrobe befitting her new station. In return, she was to be his social shield, to host dinners, to charm his business associates, to be the flawless, respectable face of Silas Thorne. "And what," she asked, her throat tight, "requires such an urgent shield, Mr. Thorne?" For a moment, he was silent. She heard the gurgle of the fountain, the rustle of a night creature in the garden. "I have recently come into a significant business opportunity," he said finally, his gaze shifting away. "A partnership with a very traditional, very pious family from the north. They are uneasy about my past. A settled, well-born wife eases their conscience. It makes me a safer bet." He looked back at her. "Your specific value is that you are a Vance of Shropshire. Your great-grandfather signed the Magna Carta, or near enough. That is a currency they understand." It made a cold, hard sense. She was not a person to him, not really. She was a credential, a line in a ledger. And yet, that credential was the one thing she still possessed that had value. Henry Creswell had tried to burn it, but Silas Thorne was telling her it was still negotiable. Inside the ballroom, the clock struck 11. Each deep, resonant chime seemed to vibrate through the stone bench. Time was passing. With every minute, her old life solidified into its ruined shape. This was her chance to reshape it, while the plaster was still wet. What of companionship? The question felt foolish as soon as she asked it. He actually chuckled, a dry, soft sound. "We are to be partners, not prisoners. You will have your friends, your interests. I will have mine. We will share a roof, a name, and a purpose. It is more honesty than most marriages in there can claim." He extended a hand, not for a romantic gesture, but like a man sealing a deal. "Do we have an agreement?" Lady Alara. Her body felt heavy. The scent of the damp earth and old stone filled her nose. She thought of returning to the ballroom alone, of the carriage ride home with her parents' silent despair, of the empty, shrinking future that awaited her. Then she looked at his hand. It was a choice. A terrible, irreversible choice. But it was her asterisk choice. She did not take his hand. Instead, she stood up, smoothing the wrinkled silk of her gown. She met his eyes, that strange new courage solidifying into something harder, like cooled wax. We do, Mr. Thorne. But we enter together. Now. A flicker of what might have been respect passed over his face. He offered his arm again. Then let us give them a performance they will not forget. Walking back into the Danworth ballroom on Silas Thorne's arm was like walking into a wall of sound that then dropped into absolute silence. The music faltered. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto them. Alara felt the gaze like a physical pressure, but she kept her chin high, her expression a calm mask she did not feel. She focused on the specific details, the chipped crystal edge of a champagne flute on a passing tray, the vivid purple feathers in Lady Danworth's turban, the way the wax from a dripping candle had formed a small, white waterfall on a silver candlestick. They walked directly to where her mother stood, a pale figure near the fireplace. Lady Vance's eyes were wide with terror and confusion. "Lady Vance," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the hush, "I must beg your forgiveness for my forwardness this evening. But in coming to your daughter's defense, I have discovered a treasure I cannot bear to part with. With your permission, I wish to formally court Lady Alara." The silence broke into a roar of whispers. Alara saw Henry Creswell's mouth actually fall open. Miss Thistlethwaite looked as if she'd swallowed a lemon. Her mother, after a stunned second, grasped the lifeline with the desperation of a drowning woman. Of course, Mr. Thorne. We are delighted." The next hour was a blur of congratulations that tasted like vinegar, of handshakes from men who had just been sneering at her, of kisses on the cheek from women whose eyes were sharp with curiosity. Through it all, Silas was a steady, imposing presence at her side. His hand on her back was a light, guiding pressure. He deflected prying questions with dry wit, complimented her mother's grace, and played the part of a smitten, if slightly roguish, suitor perfectly. But Alara's body was a map of her true feelings. Her cheeks ached from smiling. A faint, constant tremor lived in her hands, so she kept them clasped tightly around her borrowed fan. The sweet taste of the champagne they toasted with turned metallic on her tongue. As their carriage, carriage, a sleek black barouche with chestnut horses, finally pulled away from Grosvenor Square just after midnight, the performance ended. The mask fell away. They sat in silence on the plush, dark blue seats as the vehicle rattled over the cobblestones. The only light came from a small, swaying lantern outside, painting stripes of golden shadow across his impassive face. He spoke first. "You did well." "It was a farce," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was a first battle. And we won." He looked out the window. "I will call on your father tomorrow at 11. We will settle the matters of the marriage settlement. I suggest you rest. The next 3 weeks will be busy." He delivered her to her family's modest townhouse on Wimpole Street. As the footman handed her down, Silas leaned forward from the carriage interior. "One more thing," he said. "From this moment, you are no longer a victim of that fool Creswell. You are the woman who secured Silas Thorne. Remember that. It changes how you walk. It changes how they see you." The carriage clattered away into the night. Alara stood on the steps, the cold seeping through her slippers. Her mother rushed out, babbling with a mixture of relief and hysterical excitement. But Alara hardly heard her. She was thinking of Silas's last words. She went to her room, the same lavender-scented room she'd left that afternoon as a naive girl. Her maid, Annie, helped her out of the ruined white gown, now stained with grass and regret at the hem. As Annie brushed out her hair, Alara stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror. The eyes looking back were older. They held a new knowledge. The discovery that rewrote the entire night wasn't about Silas's motives. It was about her own. She had not agreed to his deal out of weakness, or even just survival. A small, hard part of her had agreed out of something else, a desire to turn the tables, to use the very rules that had broken her as her own tools. Silas Thorne hadn't rescued a helpless debutante. He had, without realizing it, just armed one. She climbed into bed, the sheets chilly. Downstairs, she could hear her parents' excited, hushed voices. The future was no longer an empty corridor. It was a complex, dangerous game. And for the first time since Henry Creswell had smiled his false smile, Alara Vance felt not hope, but a sharp, clear purpose. She had made her choice. Now she had to learn how to play. 3 weeks can feel like a lifetime, or the blink of an eye. For Alara, it was both. The days since the Danworth ball had been a whirlwind of activity, a blur of dress fittings at Madame Leclerc's shop on Bond Street, of tense, paperwork-filled meetings between her father and Silas's solicitor in the stuffy study on Wimpole Street, and of planning the small, quiet wedding that was now just 2 days away. It was a Tuesday, the 7th of May, and a hard, cold spring rain was tap-tap-tapping against the windows of Silas Thorne's grand townhouse at 24, Berkeley Square. Alara was there for what Mrs. Gibbons, the stern housekeeper, called a domestic review. She sat in the drawing room, a cavernous space decorated in deep greens and golds. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, fighting against the chill. She held a leather-bound ledger in her lap, the household accounts for the past quarter. The numbers, for coal, for candles, for the salaries of 14 indoor staff, swam before her eyes. It wasn't the figures that overwhelmed her. It was the silence. The house was beautiful, but it felt like a museum. Everything was precise, polished, and utterly devoid of life. No casual clutter, no forgotten books, no personal trinkets. It was the home of a man who lived in it, but did not live in it. Mrs. Gibbons had just left the room after a thoroughly efficient tour, and Alara was alone. The only sound was the rain, the fire, and the ponderous tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner. This was to be her fortress. These silent, elegant rooms were the walls of the deal she had struck. She set the ledger aside and walked to the tall window overlooking the square. The bare branches of the trees were black against the grey sky, shivering in the rain. She caught her own reflection in the glass, a well-drafted stranger in a modest blue day dress, her hair perfectly coiled. The woman who had wept over a wilted gardenia was gone. In her place was this composed, purposeful figure. But who was she, really? A soft knock at the door made her turn. It was not Mrs. Gibbons. It was a young woman, perhaps a year or 2 younger than Alara, with hair the same dark walnut shade as Silas's, but with wide, nervous green eyes. She wore a simple grey dress, more suited to a companion or a governess than a family member. "I'm so sorry to intrude," the young woman said, her voice soft as a mouse. The door was ajar. "I'm Clara Thorne." She offered a hesitant curtsy. "Silas is my brother." Alara's breath caught. Silas had never mentioned a sister. Not a word. "Lady Alara Vance," she said, recovering and offering a smile. "Please, come in. I did not know. I am so pleased to meet you." Clara slipped into the room, her movements quiet. She looked around as if seeing it for the first time too. "He doesn't speak of me. It's safer that way." She twisted her hands together. "I live in the country, in Kent. I've come to town just for the wedding. He thought it best I stay here, just for these few days, so we might become acquainted." 1,000 questions buzzed in Alara's mind. Safer. Why would a sister's existence be a secret? Clara walked to the fireplace, holding her palms out to the flames. "He's a good brother, you know. The very best. He sends me books, and music for the pianoforte. He had a glasshouse built for me so I could grow orchids." Her voice filled with fondness, but also a deep, underlying sadness. "He protects me." "Protects you from what?" Alara asked gently, moving to stand beside her. Clara's green eyes glistened in the firelight. "From our past. From *Kim Star." The word hung in the air. Our father was not a kind man. His reputation, well, Silas spent his whole life fighting to build something separate from it, something clean and strong. My father's debts, his cruelty, his name. It clung to Silas like a shadow. When our father died 2 years ago, Silas paid off every last penny. Over £80,000, they said. He thought he was free. But the past has long claws. Alara's heart began to beat a little faster. This was the missing piece. The urgent need for respectability wasn't just for a business deal. It was armor for his sister. "There is a man," Clara whispered, her voice dropping even lower. "Sir Roland Kettering. He was our father's closest friend, and just as wicked. He knows things. Stories that could ruin a young woman's prospects forever, true or not. He has been circling, writing Silas unpleasant letters, suggesting that unless Silas enters into certain business ventures with him, he might start sharing old tales at the worst possible moments. He wants a piece of everything Silas has built." The room felt suddenly colder, despite the fire. Alara understood now. A rogue's wife might be a curiosity, but a rogue with a vulnerable sister was a target. A truly respectable marriage, to a lady of impeccable standing, changed the battlefield. It gave Silas and Clara a social shield no amount of money could buy. It was why the deal had to be immediate. "He is marrying you," Clara said, looking directly at Alara with those earnest eyes, "to build a wall around me, to make our family name so solid, so accepted, that Sir Roland's whispers sound like the ravings of a jealous old man. He is trading his freedom for mine." The weight of it settled on Alara's shoulders, heavy and real. This was no longer just a business transaction between two people. She was now a key part of a family's survival. The strange, empty house made sense. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress under construction, and she was the flag being planted on the ramparts to show it was now under respectable command. Later that evening, after Clara had retired and Silas had returned from his business, Alara confronted him in the library. The room smelled of leather and old paper. He stood by a globe, turning it slowly with one finger. "You didn't tell me about Clara," she said, her voice calm but firm. His hand stilled on the globe. "It was not relevant to our agreement." "It is entirely relevant," she insisted. "You are not just buying a name, Silas. You are asking me to be a part of this defense. I met her. She is sweet and terrified. You are using our marriage as a bulwark against this Kettering man." He finally turned to look at her, his grey eyes guarded. "Yes. Is that a problem? The terms remain the same. Your position, your security, is unchanged." "My understanding has changed," she said, a flare of heat in her chest. "You presented this as a simple exchange. But it's a war. And you've just drafted me into your army without telling me who the enemy is." He was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the sputter of a candle. "Knowing changes nothing," he said finally, his voice flat. "It changes everything for me," she whispered. She left him in the library and asked for the carriage to take her home. As she rode through the dark, rainy streets, the realization washed over her, cold and clear. The story she had been telling herself was a lie. She had thought she was making a clever, if desperate, choice to save herself. She had seen herself as a passive prize, then a savvy negotiator. But the truth was far more complicated. She was not just a victim or a merchant. She was now, willingly or not, an accomplice. She had agreed to stand beside a man who was fighting a hidden war for his sister's future. Her respectable name was to be a weapon in that fight. The moral ground, which had felt so solid when she was simply reacting to her own ruin, now felt slippery and uncertain. That night, in her own bed on Wimpole Street, she faced the impossible choice. The wedding was in 48 hours. She could still walk away. She could cite his deception, throw his secret back in his face, and retreat to a life of quiet, permanent disgrace in the country. It would be a safe, small life. Clara would be left exposed. Sir Roland would win. Or she could go through with it. She could marry the rogue, become the fortress wall for a sister she already liked, and step into a life of comfortable, powerful uncertainty. She would be trading one kind of security for another, and accepting that her marriage would be built on a foundation of secrets and strategic defense, not affection. Staring at the canopy of her bed, she saw herself clearly for the first time. She was not a heroine from a novel. She was a young woman with limited options, who had been offered a path that involved both great risk and great purpose. She saw the calculating glint in her own heart, the part that knew this was still her best, most powerful move. And she saw a new, faint stirring of something else, a desire to protect sweet Clara from the wolves of the world, wolves she now understood all too well. She thought of Silas's empty, polished house. She thought of Clara's fearful eyes. She thought of Henry Creswell's smug face. And then Alara realized the story of her passive, powerless ruin was a lie. She had chosen this path. And now, knowing the full truth, she had to choose it again. Not as a victim, not as a merchant, but as someone who was, for better or worse, becoming a partner in a much larger, much more real story. The rain had stopped. Outside, a cold, clear silence had fallen over the sleeping city, waiting for her decision. The morning of May 20th dawned not with sunshine, but with a soft, persistent mist that clung to the London rooftops. It was the kind of day that felt hushed, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Inside St. George's Church on Hanover Square, the scent of beeswax and old stone was sharp in the cool air. 24 guests sat in the polished wooden pews, a small, carefully selected audience of family, a few of Silas's most trusted business associates, and Clara, who wore a dress of pale green silk and a smile that trembled with hope. Alara stood at the end of the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a gown of silver-grey satin, not white. It was a quiet statement. This was not a conventional fairy tale. The fabric whispered as she walked, a soft sound that seemed loud in the quiet church. She kept her eyes forward, on Silas, who waited at the altar. He looked formidable in a coat of dark blue, his expression unreadable, but as she drew closer, she saw him glance once, quickly, at his sister. In that glance, she saw the whole reason they were there. The vicar's words washed over her. To have and to hold, for better, for worse. They felt less like promises and more like the terms of their contract, recited aloud. When it was time, she placed her hand in Silas's. His fingers were warm and steady, and for a brief moment, his thumb pressed against her knuckles, a silent signal. A partnership. Then it was done. I now pronounce you man and wife. There was no triumphant cheer, only a soft, relieved applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, man and wife, Alara felt the final door to her old life click shut. She was now Mrs. Silas Thorne. The deal was sealed. The wedding breakfast was held at the townhouse on Berkeley Square. The long mahogany table in the dining room groaned under platters of ham, glazed pheasant, and pyramids of strawberries. The chatter was polite, the laughter a little strained. Alara played her part perfectly, smiling, accepting compliments, pouring tea. She noticed a man who had not been at the church, a guest of one of the associates. He was perhaps 50, with hair the colour of tarnished silver and a smile that didn't reach his cold, pale eyes. He watched her, and Clara, with the interest of a collector examining a new piece of porcelain. A chill that had nothing to do with the morning mist went down her spine. She didn't need an introduction. This was Sir Roland Kettering. He had come to survey the new defences. As the guests began to leave in the afternoon, Silas drew her aside in the hallway, his voice low. You saw him. Yes. He will test you. He will try to find a weakness. Your role is to be impeccable, unshakable. A lady he cannot touch. Alara nodded, but a new feeling was stirring inside her, hot and bright. It wasn't fear. It was anger. This man thought he could haunt a sweet girl like Clara with old ghosts. He thought he could threaten her new, fragile family. And he thought she, Alara, was just a pretty, passive shield. Her flaw, her deep, hard understanding of society's cruel rules, learned in the furnace of her own ruin, suddenly didn't feel like a flaw anymore. It felt like a weapon she had spent the last month quietly sharpening. She knew how whispers worked. She knew how to spot a lie in a smile. She knew the value of a perfectly timed compliment and the poison of a well-placed piece of silence. The first test came just a week later. It was the Covington Garden Party, the first major society event of the summer season, and Alara's debut as Mrs. Thorne. The sprawling lawns were a riot of colour, striped tents offering lemonade and cakes, a string quartet playing near the rose garden. She wore a dress of cornflower blue, and on her arm was Silas, a solid, imposing presence. Clara walked a few steps behind with her companion, looking like a startled fawn. They had not been there 10 minutes before Sir Rowland Kettering materialized, as if from the mist itself. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, taking her hand in a grip that was just a little too tight. "A delight. And this must be the dear sister. Clara, you have grown into quite a picture of modest grace. It reminds me so much of your dear mother." His tone was slick, like oil on water. Clara went pale. Silas's arm tensed under Alara's hand. This was the opening move, a veiled reference to the past, a reminder that he held memories they wished forgotten. Alara did not freeze. She smiled, a warm, bright smile she had practiced in the mirror. She gently extracted her hand. "Sir Rowland, how kind of you to remember. Silas has told me how you were such a support to his family in years past. It is so important to have friends who stand by one, isn't it? Especially when the world can be so quick to judge based on mere rumors." She let her gaze sweep over him, kind and utterly innocent. "You must come to dinner next week. We are so eager to hear your stories." For a fraction of a second, his oily smile slipped. She had not cowered. She had not challenged him. She had, with perfect politeness, reframed him from a threatening ghost to a slightly pathetic, aging family friend. She had taken his implied power and handed it back to him, neatly wrapped in bland courtesy. "Indeed," he muttered, his eyes turning chilly. As he moved away, Silas looked down at her, a question in his eyes. Alara simply adjusted her lace shawl. "The wall must have a gate," she said quietly. "Better we control who comes in and out." That was the moment everything shifted. Alara stopped being just a shield. She became a strategist. She began to use her hard-won social knowledge not just to defend, but to weave a new story. She hosted a small musical evening, making sure to invite the season's biggest gossips, Lady Penworth and her daughters. She asked Clara to play the pianoforte, a piece by Bach that was complex and beautiful. As the last note faded, Alara gushed, not about the music, but about Clara's kind heart, her charitable work with an orphanage in Kent. She painted a picture of a saintly, quiet young woman, above reproach. She made a point of walking with Silas in Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, always appearing devoted, always gracious. When asked about their swift engagement, she would laugh lightly and say, "When you know, you know." And when a man like Silas decides on something, he does not dawdle. She turned the scandal into a romance, the deal into destiny. One afternoon, about a month into her marriage, she was in the study reviewing invitations when Silas entered. He held a letter, his knuckles white around the paper. "From Kettering. He has invited himself to dine tomorrow. He says he has some amusing anecdotes about my father he wishes to share with my new wife." This was the direct attack, a threat to spill ugly stories across her dinner table. Alara set down her pen. The old fear tried to rise up, the fear of whispers and ruined reputations. But she pushed it down. That fear was her fuel now. She looked at Silas, truly looked at him, this man who had built an empire to protect his sister, who had married a ruined girl to complete the fortress. She saw the tension in his jaw, the shadow in his eyes. He was ready for a battle. But she had a different idea. "Let him come," she said, her voice calm. "But we will not be his audience. We will give him one." The next evening, the dining room was set for 12. Alara had not invited friends. She had invited weapons, the stanchest, most influential matrons of the ton, including the formidable Dowager Countess of Ridgeway, who despised vulgar gossip, and the Bishop of London's wife, a woman of impeccable morality. The table was a masterpiece of silver and crystal, the air rich with the smell of roasted lamb and rosemary. Sir Roland arrived, clearly expecting an intimate, manipulative evening. His face fell when he saw the crowd. The dinner began. Alara steered the conversation towards safe, lofty topics: the new British Museum, charitable works, Italian art. Whenever Sir Roland tried to interject with a "that reminds me of a wild time with old Alastair Thorne," Alara or the Dowager would smoothly cut in with a question about politics or the weather, drowning him out. Finally, over the port, he grew desperate. In a lull, his voice cut through the polite chatter. "Silas, your father always said a man's past was his own personal museum. Some rooms just aren't fit for the public, eh?" A heavy silence fell. All eyes turned to him, then to Silas, then to Alara. This was the moment. The open challenge. Alara did not look at Silas. She looked at Sir Roland, and she smiled her warm, hostess smile. She set her napkin neatly beside her plate. Every ear in the room was straining. "Trust is a ledger, Sir Roland," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "Some men only know how to make withdrawals." The words hung in the air, simple, sharp, and utterly devastating. It was not a denial. It was not an argument. It was a judgment. And it came from her, the respectable, poised, untouchable Mrs. Thorne. She had just publicly categorized him as a social bankrupt. A flush crept up Sir Roland's neck. The Dowager Countess gave a soft, approving "ain't." The bishop's wife nodded slightly, as if hearing a profound truth. The spell was broken. The attack had been parried, not with a sword, but with the precise, cutting edge of social grace. Sir Roland made his excuses soon after. As the front door closed behind him, the conversation in the dining room resumed, warmer and more lively than before. The fortress had held. More than that, it had shown its strength. Later, after the last guest had left, Silas found Alara in the drawing room. She was standing by the same window she had looked out of weeks before, but the feeling in the house was different. It was no longer a museum. It was alive. He didn't speak for a moment, just stood beside her, looking out at the dark square. "You were remarkable," he said finally, the word sounding rusty, as if he wasn't used to giving compliments. "We were," she corrected softly. She turned to face him. The understanding between them was no longer just a contract on paper. It was a real thing, forged in the fire of a shared fight. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw not just a partner in a deal, but the man who carried the weight of his sister's world on his shoulders. And he saw not just a respectable wife, but the woman with the steady hands and the clever mind who had just helped him bear it. The final confrontation with the past wasn't over, but the first major battle was won. And as Alara stood there, she knew the next move was hers to make. She was no longer playing a part written by others. She was writing her own. The scent of gardenias filled the Danworth ballroom. It was the first ball of a new season, a full year since the night that had shattered Alara's world and rebuilt it into something entirely different. The room was the same, the 12 glittering chandeliers, the black and white marble floor, the potted ferns in their familiar places by the terrace doors. But nothing else was. Alara stood not by the ferns, hiding, but near the center of the room, a calm island in the swirling sea of satin and tailcoats. She wore a dress of deep emerald green, the color of resilience and growth. Pinned to her bodice was a single, perfect gardenia, its waxy petals glowing white against the rich fabric. She had bought it herself that morning from a little flower stall on Piccadilly, a small, personal ritual. Around her, the music and laughter were not a mocking blur, but a familiar symphony she now understood how to conduct. She watched the debutantes in their white gowns, their eyes wide with hope and fear, and felt a distant pang of recognition, like looking at a portrait of her younger self. Her gaze found Clara across the room. Clara was no longer a shadow. She wore a dress of soft lavender and was chatting animatedly with a group of other young ladies, her laughter ringing out, clear and unafraid. The protection of the Thorne name, solidified over a year of impeccable social maneuvering, had given her the freedom to simply be herself. Sir Roland Kettering had left London for the continent months ago, his poison ineffective against the united, respectable front the Thornes presented. Silas was beside Alara, a steady, silent presence. He didn't need to guide her or shield her anymore. They stood together as partners, having weathered the storm they had entered into as strangers. The deal, the contract, was still there, but it was no longer the foundation. It was the cellar, deep underground and solid, while something else had been built above it, room by room, in the quiet moments of shared purpose. Satisfied, partner? Silas asked, his voice low, just for her. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at Clara's smiling face. Alara didn't answer immediately. She let her eyes travel the room. She saw Henry Creswell. He was attempting to converse with a wealthy American heiress, his charm seeming a little worn, a little desperate. He caught her eye across the distance. For a second, he looked as if he might approach. Alara simply offered him a small, polite, and utterly meaningless smile, the kind one gives a vague acquaintance, and turned her attention back to Silas. The past had lost all its power to wound. It was just an old, faded page in a book she had closed. Not satisfied, she said finally, a genuine smile touching her lips. Content. There's a difference. He nodded, understanding in his grey eyes. Contentment was active. It was something you built and tended to, like the small garden she had started in the sunniest corner of the Berkeley Square house. It wasn't a prize you won and put on a shelf. The spring had turned to summer, then to a crisp autumn, and a cold winter, and now it was spring again. Time had done its work, not in erasing the past, but in layering over it with new experiences. The chipped blue door of her parents' Wimpole treehouse felt like a memory from another life. The rust on the bumper of the old carriage she used to take was replaced by the smooth, dark lacquer of her own equipage. The man with the yellow shoes who had sneered at her a year ago now bowed respectfully as Mrs. Thorne. Later in the evening, as the clock neared midnight, Alara found herself drawn to the terrace doors. She slipped outside, the cool air a relief. The same stone balustrade, the same scent of damp earth and early roses. A year ago, she had stood here, clutching a dying flower, her future in ashes. Now, her hands rested lightly on the cool stone, empty and calm. She heard the soft tread of footsteps behind her. Silas. He came to stand beside her, not too close, but a comfortable, companionable distance away. They looked out at the shadowy garden in silence. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind that exists between people who no longer need to fill the space with words. Clara has accepted an invitation to visit the Ridgeways in Sussex for the summer, he said after a while. The Dowager Countess personally requested her. She's become quite fond of her. Alara felt a warm glow of pride. She'll love the countryside there. It's beautiful in July. She asked if you might join her for a few weeks, Silas continued, his tone casual. She said the house feels most like a home when you're in it. The words settled over Alara, softer than the mist. She thought of the house on Berkeley Square. The empty museum had slowly filled. Her favourite books were on the library shelves. A sketch she'd done of the garden sat framed on the desk in the study. Clara's embroidery basket lived permanently by the drawing-room window. It was not a fortress anymore. It was simply their home. I might, she said, but only if you promise not to let the household accounts fall into complete chaos in my absence. I saw the coal bill last month. Someone is ordering far too much. He gave a soft chuckle, a real one. I believe that was your order, for the new glasshouse for Clara's orchids. Ah, Alara said, smiling into the darkness. A necessary extravagance. They lapsed back into silence. The music from the ballroom swelled for a final waltz. Alara didn't feel the pull to go back inside. This moment, here in the quiet dark, felt more real than all the glittering noise. Thank you, Alara, Silas said, his voice quiet now. It was the first time he had ever used just her first name without her title. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was an acknowledgement. For holding the line. For being smarter than he was about the world that had tried to break her. For seeing Clara not as a duty, but as a sister. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the garden, where the first buds of climbing roses were just visible on the trellis in the moonlight. New growth on old, sturdy vines. "You're welcome, Silas," she replied. And that was it. No grand lesson stated, no dramatic pronouncements. Just two people, standing side by side, looking at the garden where one life had ended and another, more complicated, more resilient one had begun. The scar was there, the memory of the ruin, the sharp deal, the hidden war. But a scar is not an open wound. It's a sign of healing. It's proof you survived. The clock inside struck the final hour, its chimes deep and resonant. The music ended. The ball was over. Alara took one last deep breath of the night air, smelling the gardenia on her dress and the promise of the roses to come. Then she turned, and together they walked back inside, not as a rogue and his rescued debutante, but as Silas and Alara Thorne. Partners. A family. A story that was still being written, one quiet, contented chapter at a time. And sometimes, the story whispered, the most shocking deal of all can become the most solid foundation for a life built not on fantasy, but on trust, respect, and the quiet, daily choice to stand together.